let's start with a simple question. Should we drink coffee? Well, it depends on what day of the week we read the news. On Monday, coffee is good for you because it will prolong your life. On Friday, coffee is bad for you because it will increase your risk of developing cancer. These are the opposite results of two observational studies. The point is, observational studies easily highlight associations between variables, but they cannot tell us whether these associations are causal. And this is due to limitations like confounding and selection issues. Anyway, observational studies are important in biomedical research because they can tell us what we are doing, how we are doing it, they can inform us about the harms of medical interventions, and they can generate a lot of useful hypotheses. But when it comes to causation, they often fail. For example, most of the common medical practices that end up being contradicted by well-conducted randomized controlled trials had originally been adopted based on findings from observational studies. And yet, observational studies represent a huge part of the health studies that the media choose to cover. For instance, when compared with the high-impact medical journals, the newspapers have been shown to preferentially cover observational research over randomized controlled trials. So, since observational studies represent a huge part of the health studies, we wondered how the contemporary Italian online media report on this kind of research. And so we, two cardiologists, Raffaele Rasoini and I, together with two health journalists, Rebecca De Fiore and Fabio Ambrosino, picked up an article that is entitled Long-Term Cardiovascular Outcomes of COVID-19 that was published in Nature Medicine on the 7th of February 2022. We chose this article because it was published on a high-impact medical journal and because it received a strong media coverage, maybe because it's related to a topic of great interest and concern. So this is a retrospective cohort study aiming at characterizing the post-acute manifestations of COVID-19 by comparing about 150,000 veterans with COVID-19 diagnosis against two huge control cohorts of about 5 million people each without COVID-19 diagnosis. The study observed that following 30 days and within 12 months after a COVID-19 diagnosis, people with such a diagnosis had higher cardiovascular disease rates than the other people without COVID-19 diagnosis. So, this is an observational study that found an association between some exposure, that is COVID-19, and some outcome, that is cardiovascular disease. Now, every time we read about an association in observational studies, we should ask ourselves, are there other credible alternative explanations or reasons for this association? And the funny thing is the answer to this question happens to be the real story, the real interesting story. So for some of the people in this study, this association could be real, could be causal, but other credible explanations can exist. For example, people with COVID-19 diagnosis may have undergone more diagnostic tests, and so they may have received more cardiovascular diagnosis, not related to COVID-19 sequelae, but related to an increased medical attention. Or we may hypothesize that people with COVID-19 diagnosis were more vulnerable in the first place, and these vulnerabilities may have predisposed them to both COVID-19 diagnosis and other illnesses, such as cardiovascular disease. The point is that despite all the adjustments that the authors of the study made, the study doesn't allow to understand whether the association between COVID-19 and cardiovascular disease is a causal association or just the result of a selection bias. So we searched for online news articles that covered the Nature Medicine paper as main subject, that were written in Italian language, and that were released within 2 weeks after the publication of the Nature Medicine paper. And we got 30 news articles. Then, based on resources aimed at doctors, but also at journalists, about the proper reporting of observational research, we identified 5 thematic categories that we employed as a minimum reference standard to evaluate the quality of medical reporting in the news articles. Let me be clear on this. Our intention wasn't to address if journalists had done an in-depth critical appraisal of the Nature Medicine paper. But at the same time, some basic skills are needed for journalists to approach this kind of research and to report in a reliable way on it. So it's these basic skills that we investigated. The first category that we investigated is causality. The news article should report that this is an observational study, and as such, it's very, very difficult to infer causation from the observed associations. And the language throughout the news articles should mirror this concept and should avoid causal language. The second category that we investigated is actionability. If there is some uncertainty about the relationship between an exposure and an outcome, such in this case, the news articles should avoid to recommend practical actions based on these single retrospective study results. Because for example, the news articles should avoid to, shouldn't mention the need for people with previous COVID-19 and cardiovascular, and that are asymptomatic to go and check their heart or to go and check their vascular system. Because if we promote practical actions that without an evidence of a net benefit, this could lead people to fear, to costs, to incidental findings that in turn could promote overdiagnosis, overtreatment, and cascades of care. So we investigated if the news articles recommended practical actions based on these study results directly or through some experts' voices. And the third category that we investigated is critical evaluation, that is made by 3 main points: design, context, and generalizability. The first point is design. The news article should mention that this is a retrospective study because retrospective studies are generally weaker than prospective ones and more prone to bias. And then about context, the news article should ask if there are other studies reporting on the same topic and if the results from these studies are coherent with this one or not. And then about generalizability. People in this study were all veterans, and the vast majority of them were male, white, in their 60s, unvaccinated, and affected by alpha or delta variants of COVID-19 in 2020. Now, how would these results apply to an Italian black, not veteran, and vaccinated woman in her 30s who catches Omicron in 222? I would say they don't. Did the media report on this discrepancy? And then we investigated if both spin and fear-mongering were represented in the news articles, whereas spin refers to a medical reporting that is exaggerated and as such fails to reflect the real nature and range of findings, and spin and fear-mongering refers to the use of words or images that evoke fear or a sense of impending danger in the audience. And here are the results. 100% of the news articles missed the point of causality, meaning that no one mentioned that the inability of inferring causation is the chief limitation of observational studies, and meaning that all the news articles used a causal language. And here is an example. Actionability. Rather coherently, over a half of the news articles recommended practical actions based on these single retrospective study results, mainly through the voice of the first author of the study. Critical evaluation. Less than 15% of the news articles attempted a basic critical evaluation of the Nature Medicine paper. And both spin and fear-mongering were highly represented in the news articles, with detective spin in 75% of the news articles and fear-mongering in 83% of the news articles. And here are a few examples. So, even if these results don't depict a rosy picture of the Italian online media coverage of this observational study, nothing seems so new. In fact, as Stephen has already said before, the limitations that we can detect about medical reporting are the same limitations that we can detect at any level of the process that happens before the news. Basically, it's poor medical research that makes the medical reporting poor. For example, the limitation of inferring causation from the association observed in observational studies is a limitation that is rarely mentioned in abstract of journals and coherently in press releases and in associated news stories. And there is, it seems, a gradient. In our case, if we go and check the interviews with some of the Nature Medicine people authors, or if we go and check the press release from Veterans Affairs Department, and we look for the same categories that we investigated in our paper, we find exactly the same criticalities. And then about spin, biomedical literature is full of spin. For example, in this systematic review, including 93 reports of randomized clinical trials from 6 high-impact journals, a positive spin of statistically non-significant outcomes was found in 57% of abstracts and in 67% of main text of the published articles. And then the attitude of recommended practical actions based on the results of non-randomized studies. Also, this is not a new attitude. In this study, 56% of the authors of observational studies were found to make practical recommendations based on their study results. And finally, it seems that journalists have to face an obstacle course to achieve a reliable medical reporting. They have to face poor medical research in the first place. They have to face the progressive cutting of scientific sections from the newsroom, the medical jargon. They have to face competition for spaces, restricted times for releasing the news, a difficult access to the primary literature. But even all these hurdles don't exonerate journalists and don't exonerate doctors from the primary responsibility of inaccurate medical information. And so what can we do to improve medical reporting? I don't have a specific answer. The first tip is to have a medicine and the media course here in Italy. But I can reiterate 2 suggestions. Journalists should have a skeptical attitude in approaching biomedical research. Just because a paper is published on a medical journal, or just because some expert says great things about that paper, it doesn't mean it's useful science for people. But skeptical attitude alone is not enough because it remains just an attitude if not supported by a method. Luca Sofri, the director of the Italian online website Il Post, nailed it, and he said good journalism opposes to bad journalism with correctness, accuracy, good faith, fact-checking. It opposes with a method. And the method that we doctors use to critically approach the biomedical literature is evidence-based medicine. And we use that to help people to make informed health choices. So also journalists should learn the basic skills of evidence-based medicine in order to approach the biomedical research and in order to reliably report on it. And in the very end, when we embark on a journey to do something better, we should be very clear on our destination. And I think that Lisa Schwartz, that was a champion in improving medical communications, beautifully defined what the destination of our efforts should be. Our goal is to give people a realistic sense of what is known and what is not known, how hopeful or worried they should be. We want to provide understandable medical information that hasn't been influenced by other interests and that isn't trying to sell or promote anything.